Did America have a Christian founding? The answer may surprise you. Let's talk about it with Mark David Hall on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
And we are so glad that you're with us. This is going to be a great hour, and you're going to learn stuff you never knew before. And by the way, I'm Steve, the aforementioned Steve Brown, the old white guy. Our resident megachurch pastor, Zach Van Dyke, is here. Like his favorite founding fathers, Zach is young, scrappy, and hungry.
All right, yeah. Yeah. And I like the musical Hamilton.
Yeah,
so
there you
that's
go.
a good quote.
Didn't get lunch, huh?
Yeah, right.
Matthew was explaining to me about Hamilton.
Yeah.
Did you
and
not
how
know about
big
that?
I never heard of it. I am a
good
recluse.
grief.
I know.
I'm with you,
the
Steve.
only one in the universe.
No, you and me. You and me both.
Next time it comes here, I'm going to take you, Steve. You
I'll
and I.
go.
You and I will go.
I'd like that.
All right.
You're not going to take me, Zach?
Matthew told me how it worked out, so I'll be looking forward to that. Speaking of Matthew Porter, he's with us. He's just hungry.
It's true.
Our producer, Jinx, is working hard in the little glass booth. Jinx's favorite American hero is James Madison's wife, Dolly, because she invented all of those snack cakes.
Those ho-hos and
Yeah. Thank you, Dolly Madison.
And
Well,
our
historic Twinkie.
right.
Our video director, John Myers, is in the tech bunker. And if anyone listening has any computer problems, feel free to call John. He won't answer, but feel free to call. Dr. George Bingham is here. As the president of Key Life, George collects little rectangular portraits of past U.S. presidents and founding fathers. He's especially fond of Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah.
If you would care to add to his collection.
All about the Benjamin.
Rap reference.
And then Kathy Wyatt is the soft feminine side of the program. Kathy is so polite. Had she been alive at the time of Patrick Henry, she would have exclaimed, "Give me liberty," or "Give me death, please."
World of difference.
Listen, our guest today, and I've been looking forward to this.
Well, I'm glad he went right past that because, yeah.
Should have stuck with
Would
the cake
you like
reference.
to discuss it?
No. I'm
We-
happy for you to just, yeah. Yeah.
Our guest is Mark David Hall, and he served at George Fox University, where he's the Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics, faculty fellow in the William Penn Honors Program. Mark received a BA in Political Science from Wheaton College and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Virginia. In addition to teaching, he's director of the John Dickinson Forum for the Study of American Founding Principles. Mark has written a great book, and, you know, we could go on telling you about him, but we do have a program to do. But he's written a great book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? A book which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers. Mark, thanks for taking your time to be with us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Steve.
You know, I've been reading your book this morning, and, you know, you have a tendency to be a bit in your face, but you do it nicely. You know, you're kicking against the goads, or to mix the metaphor, swimming against the tide of a lot of scholars who have told us that were not Christian, that the founders were not Christian, that they were deists, that Jefferson had scissors and put it in his Bible, and that they all were as close as you can be to a pagan while nodding in God's direction. Why do they?
That's exactly.
And your book says nonsense. That's just not true. Why would they keep saying it?
That's a great question, Steve, and you're exactly right. So the way the book works is it has 5 substantive chapters, and I set each one up looking at a different myth, by which I mean a false story. So the first chapter, for instance, most or many of America's founders were deists. America's founders created a godless constitution, that they wanted religious liberty because they were an Enlightenment rationalist, and that they desired the strict separation of church and state. You can find scholar after scholar, jurist after jurist who make these sort of claims in the most prestigious of Ivy League presses from the U.S. Supreme Court. And it really is shocking because there's so very little evidence to support them. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. Just to name one, and we can go into others later, I think oftentimes these jurists and scholars are looking for a usable past. That is, they want the separation of church and state today. And so they pretend that, say, Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist, where he does, in fact, talk about the First Amendment as creating a wall of separation between church and state, they act as if that's normative, whereas, as you know, it's not normative at all. And in fact, I'm not even sure why we would look to Jefferson, as he didn't help draft or ratify the First Amendment.
You know, the amazing thing, too, is that it's not just pagans that are saying this. Christians are saying it. I don't think the Christians have an agenda, but are they just going along with the tide, or what?
That's a great question. I think sometimes one problem I found is that it seems like any scholar feels that he or she can just sit down and write a book on religion and the American founding, even if they don't have much expertise. And the methodological error they almost always make is they look at 5 or 6 founders, the 4 who became president, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, usually in Alexander Hamilton and Ben Franklin, and then they extrapolate from these 6 individuals to the entire American founding. And the problem with this is they're just profoundly unrepresentative founders. They're great men. They should be studied, but they're not representative. Franklin, for instance, lived over half the last 35 years of his life in Europe. Jefferson and Adams spent significant time in Europe. Of the 6 men I just mentioned, all were worshiping in Anglican churches by the end of their lives, whereas 50 to 75% of Americans in the era are Calvinists. And they're almost completely left out of our little sample, except for John Adams, who did worship in a Congregationalist church, but is not a good example of the Calvinist of the era.
Yeah. Do you, is that agenda an intentional one by those who want a secular government, or is it just a hopeful one? Is there planning? Let's move our nation in a direction that is more secular because it gives us more freedom. Why do they do that?
That's a great question. I try to be very careful to impugn motives, so I don't want to say someone's intentionally attempting to deceive unless I have very good reasons to believe this to be the case.
Well, you give us the facts. I'll impugn motives. Go ahead.
Get our roles clear.
Yeah.
I think that's a lot more likely when you're talking about Supreme Court justices or legal advocates attempting to make arguments in the public square. I think with scholars, especially the Christian scholars, I think they probably don't intend to deceive. I think they just, they only have so much time to do so much work, so they turn to the 5 or 6 really important Americans for whom we have lots of records. And then it's a simplistic error, but they do it nonetheless. They generalize from these views. Now, almost inevitably, they'll say, well, most founders were deists, but not all of them, as Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry were Orthodox Christians. So almost everyone recognizes there are at least a few Orthodox Christians running around, but the picture they paint is indisputable. You can't walk away from their books without thinking that most of America's founders were deists. Now, there is some good scholarship out there, so please don't hear me as impugning all scholarship, but it's far too many scholars who are saying things like most of America's founders were Enlightenment radicals. It's just not true.
Have you, and we have a pre-publication copy of your book, but is it out now? Can people get it?
So I just heard today the official release date is October 29th, but my agent, who lives in New York City, received a copy today. And so I think if you've pre-ordered a copy on Amazon, you might be receiving it over the next couple of days. So definitely one could go to Amazon right now, order it, and hopefully receive it certainly within a week.
You know, don't you, that their people are not going to be happy with you. I mean, there'll be some that'll rise up and call you blessed, but some people are going to say some really bad stuff about you. Are you prepared for that? Do you have a mean streak? I'm just checking.
You know, I think I have a confidence streak. So over the last month, I've debated Andrew Seidel, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and Stephen Green, who was for many years with Americans United for Separation of Church and State. The latter was very reasonable, the former not so much, and he really went after me, but I'm confident in what I'm doing, and I'm happy to engage in debate. That debate with Seidel, incidentally, can be watched on C-SPAN. If you just Google both of our names, it should come up.
All right. Listen, we want to talk a little bit about that when we come back. And like Jesus, we are coming back. If you're surrounded by secularists who make fun of your religion and your past and your heritage, we're going to give you some ammunition. So you want to stay tuned and stay with us till the end of the broadcast. And if you don't, you'll get the hives. Listening to Steve Brown, etc., and our guest is author and Professor Mark David Hall. We're talking about his newest book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? Separating Modern Myth from Historical Truth. You were before the break, you were talking about a debate that you had with some people who radically disagree with what you said. Tell us about the debate.
Sure. The more interesting debate was with Andrew Seidel, who's from the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And these folks believe that the Establishment Clause requires the public square to be scrubbed free of religion. So, for instance, when Ohio created a Holocaust memorial in 2014 or so and wanted to include a Star of David within this Holocaust memorial, the Freedom from Religion folks complained. And they said, no, you can't do this because of the wall of separation between church and state. But of course, the Constitution requires no such thing. It prohibits Congress and then by extension the states from passing a law respecting the establishment of religion. But certainly a Star of David and a Holocaust memorial, a cross and a World War I memorial, the cities of Los Angeles and San Francisco, nothing in the Establishment Clause requires religion to be removed from the public square. And so we debated this question. He didn't make very many historical arguments, which was probably smart because he has very few good ones to make. Instead, he made arguments to the effect of you can't simultaneously affirm the first commandment, that is, of the biblical commandments, and the First Amendment. And I think that's an utterly ridiculous argument. Of course, you can affirm the first commandment that we shall know God besides the Lord our God, but also affirm the First Amendment that every American has religious freedom to believe or not to believe as he or she sees fit. What was really interesting, and here's where you're right, I have to have a thick skin, toward the very end, he went after me. He said, oh, Professor Hall wants to create this exclusive, horrible, totalitarian theocracy where Christians are oppressing other people. And as evidence, he pointed out that I signed a brief, I helped write a brief, actually, in the Bladensburg Cross case. This World War I memorial, which is, in fact, a giant cross, and it's now on public land. And the Freedom from Religion types wanted to have this removed or somehow decapitated or altered in some way. And I signed a brief that said, no, nothing in the Establishment Clause requires this cross to be removed. What's sort of amazing is 7 justices agreed with that position. So the 5 conservatives and 2 liberals. And I just point that out to say this was not some sort of radical position. it's a position, I think, which is well within the mainstream of American jurisprudence.
Wow, that's it's funny. This is not what I was gonna comment on, but it just feels like there should be right now a golden age of First Amendment. In seasons in the past, it was the liberals who were like, "You've got to be able to say all these words and stuff." Yes, and now conservatives are like, "This is really important stuff." Like, if nothing else, it feels like we should be able to meet in the middle here on the First Amendment. And go, yes. If we don't agree on anything else, we can all come together and go, First Amendment is really important, and we should protect it. But I don't know. Is that not going to happen?
I think you're exactly right. And the sad thing is that we kind of reached that point in American history in the late 80s, early 90s. I'm sure you all remember the case of Oregon versus Smith, where the U.S. Supreme Court said, in fact, that Native Americans don't have a right to use peyote in a religious ceremony as a matter of the First Amendment. Almost right away, Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to protect the ability of Native Americans to use peyote in religious ceremonies and all sorts of other religious practices. This was passed 97-3 in the Senate. It was passed unanimously in the House. It was signed into law by President Bill Clinton. There was a consensus that religion is important and religious liberty needs to be protected, and not just for the Christian, but for the Jew and the Muslim and the Native American. Over the last 15 years, though, we've seen a shift. We've seen an assault on religious liberty. The Obama administration led that assault, and most liberals have fallen into line, and it's very sad, really.
So, just as we're setting the table on this thing, I love that the title of the book actually asks a question. So, to define the terms of the argument, when you say a Christian founding, I love how you do it in the book. You're like, that can mean multiple things. So you spread all those out on the table, and then you kind of lean towards one that is probably the best workable definition to proceed from. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So you're exactly right. I lay out a couple of different possibilities. We might mean that simply America's founders would have identified themselves as Christians. If that's the case, clearly we did. 98% Protestant, 2% Roman Catholic, about 2,000 Jews. But that's not a very interesting finding. They might have been Christians who were influenced by secular ideas or not particularly pious Christians. So I move on to go through a couple of different possibilities, but let me just land on where I land. I contend that influence is the key, that America's founders were influenced by Christian ideas and ideas developed within the Christian tradition of political reflection. Now, these ideas are not distinctly or uniquely Christian. One could embrace them for other reasons, but it just so happens in the late 18th century, the best way to understand why they embrace doctrines such as the imago Dei, that humans are created in the image of God, that humans are sinful, that liberty has to be constrained by moral law, or for Christian reasons. An analogy I make sometimes, I teach at George Fox University, which is a university that comes out of the Friends or the Quaker tradition. Quakers, of course, are historically pacifists. So I have friends here who are lifelong Quakers who are pacifists. Now, one could become a Quaker and become a pacifist because one reads Gandhi or because one experiences war and finds it to be horrific. But I think the best possible explanation in the case of my friends that are lifelong Quakers is because of this Quaker tradition. So in the same way, I argue that America's founders were heavily influenced by their Christian convictions.
We're coming up on a break, so you might have to answer this more fully on the other side. But I like to fancy myself a scholar as well of Hamilton the musical, not the person. I've seen it 3 times. Really like that guy. But I know it's probably not. I read the book that it's based on too, which I don't know how accurate it is. But my question is, him and Jefferson, all these guys had such an influence on our founding. What did they actually believe about church and state? Like, do you know what their views of the church were and how they thought it should interact with the government?
Sure. Let me answer the question with respect to Hamilton briefly, and then maybe we can come back to the founding generation more broadly, because I think you always do have to divide these things, and particularly someone like Hamilton, who is very much of an outlier, right? He's not even born in America. He's born in Jamaica. He comes to America and just rises through the ranks of American military men and legal professionals absurdly quickly. As a young man, Hamilton is indisputably very pious. He then, when he gets to America, he sort of goes off the rails a little bit. We know, for instance, he has an extramarital affair. That's a key part of the musical, right? Now, here some Christian historians will say, well, look, this is evidence that America doesn't have a Christian founding because Hamilton acted in an unchristian fashion. I agree that extramarital affairs are not what good Christians do, but it doesn't make him not a Christian. It certainly doesn't make his political ideas unchristian. But then towards the end of his life, he has a conversion experience where he clearly pulls back into an orthodox variety of Christianity. And I didn't even get to church-state stuff, but we can with him later or with others later if you would like.
We'll do that on the other side of the break.
All right.
Last time I checked, the Bible said the heart's deceitful above all things. And everybody at this table is a sinner. And they are all bad. Well, I'm not. I'm ordained. That's another thing altogether. Hey, guys, you don't want to miss a bit of this. And you want to get the book, a great book for small group study. Did America have a Christian founding? Don't you dare go away. Hey, thanks for joining us on Steve Brown, etc. Our guest, Mark David Hall. You can find out more about him at markdavidhall.org. And you can follow him on Twitter, too, at MDH_GFU. The book is Did America Have a Christian Founding? A book that is a must-read by an informed person.
Yeah, so on the other side of the break, I asked about Hamilton, which I'm glad to hear a little bit more about his story. But the other question was about the separation between church and state. And the way I've always heard it, it was like the founding fathers were determined that there would be this impenetrable wall between church and state in all areas, so much so that I went to Christian school growing up, but my kids have gone to public school, and I remember being like so worried, like I don't know what they're allowed. You know, I feel like the argument has been made that there's such a distinction between the two that there can be no crossover. So is that true? I mean, is that what the founding fathers had in mind, that there would be no overlap between church and state in any way?
That's a great question. And the only way you can get at this notion that the founders wanted a wall of separation between church and state is to focus very narrowly on Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And even there on a couple of documents, Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist, and then Madison's detached memorandum. One of the things I do is I show even Jefferson and Madison were not the sort of separationists that they're oftentimes painted as being, especially in what they actually did. To give just one example, and there's plenty more, the day after Jefferson finished penning his letter to the Danbury Baptist, he attended church services in the U.S. Capitol building where he heard John Leland, the great Baptist itinerant minister and himself an opponent of establishments, preach. Jefferson also made the War and the Treasury buildings available for church services. So Jefferson, at least in his actions as president, didn't act as if there was a wall of separation between church and state. But if we leave Jefferson and Madison to the side for a moment and turn to the broader constellation of America's founders, you see almost no support for this idea of strict separation. To focus just for a moment on the first federal Congress, one of the very first things this Congress did was decide to hire chaplains for the House and the Senate, two different chaplains, two different men. And they agreed to pay chaplains. They agreed to have military chaplains and to pay chaplains. They reauthorized the Northwest Ordinance. One of the first things the first federal Congress did, or one thing they got around to eventually, was drafting the Bill of Rights. 2 days after the House finished its wording for the First Amendment, Elias Boudinot, later president of the American Bible Society, said, hey, why don't we ask George Washington to issue a Thanksgiving Day proclamation? Ananias Burke of South Carolina said, we can't do that. That's a European practice. But Roger Sherman, that old Puritan from Connecticut, said, no, it's not. It's a biblical practice. It's perfectly appropriate for a Christian people. The House agreed with Boudinot and Sherman. The Senate agreed with the House. And George Washington, certainly no slouch, agreed with the Congress and issued the Thanksgiving Day Proclamation in 1789, which is robustly theologically rich. You can Google that easily enough. George Washington, Thanksgiving Day Proclamation, 1789. All of which is to say, America's founders in no way, shape, or form desired to build a wall of separation between church and state. They thought there were all sorts of ways at the national government or at the state level that church and state might cooperate. Now, they did agree on one thing, that we would not have a national church. That's what the Establishment Clause means. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. I think the most substantive thing that means is that we are not going to have a Church of the United States. They did agree on that. Other than that, pretty much it's a matter of prudence and civic friendship as to what Congress and then later the states should do or should not do.
Mark, I really like the way you structured the book in terms of asking it as these myths and then discussing them that way, and with the overall title of, did America have a Christian founding? And it seems like, there clearly is a certain point where there's a lot of debate with that. But I'm thinking back of when someone was asking a theological question, and the deep theological difference, and the answer was, well, of those people that know that it's an issue, which was a very small percentage. And it seems like we have perhaps a declining, and maybe it's the education system or whatever, but a declining sensitivity to the whole question of religion in the marketplace, and the crossover between Christian faith and our founding and so forth. Have you seen in terms of the general knowledge, general discussion, general question along that line?
Yeah, America's founders would have been very concerned. To a person, they believed that you had to have a moral citizenry in order to have a Republican form of government, and that religion, by which they meant Christianity, is absolutely necessary for citizens to be moral. So they'd be very concerned with the decline of Christianity in America. And we could probably go on about that, but I think we probably need to take another break.
You're good.
We got to pay for the big bucks we're paying you, Mark, for being on this broadcast. Guys, this is a great discussion. The book is Did America Have a Christian Founding? And you might be surprised when you read this book, because it says things they're not teaching you in school, and things that need to be said over and over again. We'll be back with Mark David Hall on the other side of the break, and it's important that you join us. You have a seat at our table. Listen up. The name of the book is Did America Have a Christian Founding? And this is a very, very important book. Our Attorney General, and I don't care what your political persuasion is, but Bill Barr was at Notre Dame recently, spoke to their law school and then to the faculty and some other venues, and he talked about an assault on religion. He talked about the dangers of that and what that's doing in our country. You might want to do some reading there, along with Did America Have a Christian Founding?
Mark, you were mentioning earlier in the break and a very amusing comment about your wife saying, "So what?" which really was funny. But obviously, a lot of what you deal with, a lot of what you write, not just in this book, but is designed for academics, et cetera. But there's very important information in here. And why do we need this in the public square? And why should we spend $26 on the book? Because it's a hardback. That's the most important reason.
That's one reason. Yeah, thank you for asking that. So I've written or edited a dozen academic books, and they're mostly read by other scholars. And so my wife did keep asking me, so what? Why should other people read this? So this is an attempt to write a book aimed at the general reading public. And I think it's important for various reasons. First of all, I argue that America's founders wanted a very robust understanding of religious liberty, an understanding of religious liberty that would protect our ability not just to believe, but to act upon our beliefs whenever possible. Religion can't be an absolute trump card that wins every time, of course. We're not going to allow an Aztec to sacrifice a baby to the sun god. But whenever possible, it should win. And all Americans are protected, not just Christians, Jews, Sikhs, Muslims. Everyone's protected. So I think that's important. As well, there are those who would use this really false story that America's founders desired to separate church and state in such a way as to hurt religious believers, to attack religious exemptions or accommodations that protect, say, Native Americans who desire to use peyote in religious ceremonies, and who use it to attack things like school voucher programs that would provide real choice in America. Now, some of these things I understand are highly debatable, and I think we should debate the merits or demerits of things like school vouchers, but we should be clear that there's no constitutional wall of separation between church and state that would prohibit a government from funding religious schools on the same terms that they fund other schools. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of real-world practical consequences that flow from the arguments that I make in this book.
Mark, this program is primarily listened to by people of faith, but occasionally, in fact, a good deal from some of the responses from people who are not believers, who don't share our faith. And I'm sure they would want me to ask the question, because we all know that we have a bunch of weird Christians. I'm one of them, so I'm an expert. But I'm not one of these who would mean by Christian censoring the movies we watch, the books we read, the things we allow in our culture. I personally think the Christian faith is a bulwark against that. But what would you say to the person who said, you're trying to create a theocracy and you're going to take my toys away?
Oh, that's a great question. That one of the reasons I argued that we had a Christian founding and not that America was founded as a Christian nation is I argued that the Christian ideas that informed the founders resulted in a constitutional order that benefits everyone. Rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances, the founders' understanding of liberty. It benefits everyone, Christian, non-Christian, and all sorts of other believers alike. Also, I go out of my way to argue things like I know some of these Christians of which you are speaking perhaps, who argue things like Islam is not a religion. Well, that's an utterly ridiculous argument. Clearly, Islam is religion. Muslims must be protected, must be allowed to believe and act upon their religious beliefs. Now, what's critical, as I already stipulated, of course, we aren't just going to allow anything in the name of religion. If a Christian or a Muslim or a Sikh or an atheist is driven by convictions to blow up a building, of course, we're going to interdict that person, arrest that person, put that person in jail. But generally, Muslims should be able to build mosques on the same terms that Christians can build churches and so forth. I mentioned earlier that the First Amendment does not create a wall of separation between church and state that requires religion be scrubbed free from the public square. So, for instance, I supported the Bladensburg Cross, this large cross that memorialized the dead in a particular county from World War I. But if Oregon wanted to do this, let's say Florida were to debate putting up a massive cross on the State House grounds to commemorate or memorialize Floridians who died in the Middle East over the last 2 decades, I would be the first one to show up and say, no, this is inappropriate. Some of those brave soldiers were not Christians. It would be inappropriate to use a cross to memorialize them. Let's come up with a way of memorializing them that includes everyone. And that might include various religious symbols like the 9/11 memorial that has crosses and menorahs and stars of David and other things. But we do need to be, good citizens. We shouldn't allow people, or we shouldn't try to make people feel excluded from this grand constitutional republic in which we live.
If I were an atheist, or if I were gay, transgender, if I were an outright pagan, I'd be your cheerleader, because the very thing that you talk about, upon which our nation was built, the Christian principles, that those are the ones that make it a safe place to be gay, to be transgender, to hold views that are really different. And if I were you guys, I'd buy Mark's book and give it to everybody I knew, because that's the only safe place you're going to find. And when you understand that, you'll shut up and quit saying such stupid things. Oh, I repent.
You were
I'm
on
sorry.
a roll
That
there,
wasn't
and
very
then yeah.
Mark, this is such a good book, and I'm so glad for you, and I'm glad for the secular venues where you're taking this message, your willingness to be vulnerable and to speak out, because somebody's got to. And we appreciate more than you know that you would spend this time with us. You might have a few closing comments, but make them just a few.
Sure. Well, let me just thank you for the good work you're doing and for having me on your program. And I do have a nice conclusion where I praise a lot of other people that are active in the public square that I would encourage my fellow unbelievers to support, but I will let you read the conclusion to see who those folks are.
Cool.
All right. The book again is Did America Have a Christian Founding by Mark David Hall. It is a must-read. Get it. Give it to your friends and then discuss it, because these are the facts that you haven't heard. Mark, thanks for being with us. God bless you.
Thanks so very much. I really appreciate it.
Folks, we're going to come back, and that last few minutes of this broadcast are often the most scintillating, the most
Interesting choice of words.
Yeah, well, we're gonna tell you who we're gonna do it unto next week. So don't go anyplace. What a great hour with Mark. We've been discussing, as we do when we're off the air, that we're doing battle with cliches in America. And people who are not religious, people who don't buy into the historic founding of our nation and some of the principles that are at the heart of it. What did you say? They have a...
Well, I think there's, broadly speaking, between conservatives and more of the liberal side, you've got a contrast in arguments. On one side, you've got kind of a logical, factual-based kind of stuff. And on the other side, a lot of times, there's just a lot of passion. And there's times and places for both. But it's tough to come to a common ground when you guys are not even... There's not even the same terms of the argument there.
That's so true.
But I think when people feel like they're not heard, that creates a lot of anger on all sides.
It really does. I agree with you. So, but it's important that we be heard too, that we say it compassionately and kindly, that we think of a few cliches and a few songs, and we work up some posters.
Yes.
So there's some passion in this.
Do it.
Okay. Anyway, a good starting point is to get this book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? Catherine, who are we going to have next week?
Well, next week we have a gentleman with us, James Smith, who's written a book, On the Road with St. Augustine, or if you're Steve Brown, you say Augustine. But anyway, a real world spirituality for restless hearts. And interestingly, I'm just going to mention this in case people are not as familiar as they should be with the Key Life website. We do have a series of blogs under kind of the general heading of the History of Grace blogs. And one of our bloggers, Jenny Young, did an article about Augustine, or St. Augustine here. And so if you haven't had a chance to catch that, you can look that up, as well as other Spurgeon and a lot of other a lot of other guys who had great things to say about the subject of grace.
So you really ought to join us. If you said, when Kathy said on the road with St. Augustine, and you thought, who? Then you need this.
Well, they probably didn't understand it because I didn't say, I had to then say Augustine. See, because everybody who listens to you would have known if I'd said it properly.
Well, it sounds more sophisticated.
Well, yeah,
to say
exactly.
Augustine. Well, at any rate, we'll spend an hour with Augustine, or Augustine.
Man, if we could get him, that'd be a killer program.
I'd get a raise, wouldn't I?
Talk about ratings, man. Somebody dig him up. We'll see what he does. Hey, join us next week. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you a wide, wide berth.